In the news tonight, His Majesty is reassured on the condition of members of security forces and civilians who were injured in yesterday's terror attack. The King chairs a meeting of the National Policy Council and says Jordan can defeat terrorism and is resilient with its national unity. And the UN Security Council agrees a resolution calling for UN officials to be allowed to monitor evacuations from the east of the Syrian city of Aleppo. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. His Majesty was reassured on the condition of members of security forces and civilians who were injured in yesterday's treacherous terror attack in Karak. The King called on the Al Hussein Medical Center, where the injured public security and gendarmerie personnel and a number of citizens were receiving treatment. King Abdullah was briefed by Director General of the Royal Medical Services, Major General Ma'in Habashni, and the medical team treating the injured on their condition and the health care they received. The King wished the injured speedy recovery and directed that they be offered the best medical care. His Majesty the King said Jordan is strong and capable of defeating terrorism and eliminating criminal terror gangs. He said as he chaired a meeting of the National Policy Council that the country, with the cohesion of its people and security forces, will remain resilient against all terrorism attempts. The meeting was held at the National Center for Security and Crisis Management in the presence of the King's advisor and chairman of the Council, His Royal Highness Prince Faisal ibn Hussein, His Royal Highness Prince Rashid ibn al-Hassan, the Prime Minister and other senior civic and military officials. His Majesty said Jordan will firmly stand against anyone trying to assault or undermine its stability and the security of its people. The King was briefed on the cowardly terrorist attack by a group of outlaws on security personnel and civilians in Karak. He offered his condolences over the victims of the attack, including security and gendarmerie forces, innocent civilians and a Canadian tourist. The King expressed his pride in the courage and sacrifices of security forces in rescuing the innocent hostages, both Jordanians and people from other nationalities. He said national unity is the mightiest weapon in facing the forces of darkness. Such vicious attacks, he vowed, will not undermine our resolve to fight the evil forces and those the destructive extremist ideology. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi called His Majesty the King to offer his condolences over the martyrs of the terror attack in Karak. In the telephone call, the Egyptian leader strongly condemned the ugly and criminal terrorist attack perpetrated by a group of outlaws and expressed his country's solidarity with Jordan in confronting terrorist gangs. The two leaders stressed the need for intensified regional and international efforts to fight and uproot terrorism. Earlier, a joint security force has killed 4 terrorists, ending an operation against the group of outlaws that rampaged through the southern city of Karak. The operation that began yesterday afternoon went into the early morning hours and ended with the killing of the 4 members of the terror group that took refuge in the Karak castle. 10 people were killed, including 7 security men. The security forces were still sweeping the vicinity and its surroundings to ensure no other terrorists remained there. The public security and gendarmerie security agencies said large quantities of automatic weapons and ammunition were seized during the security sweep. Here's more.
The terrorist attack that targeted police patrols, security forces and civilians in Karak has come to an end. Security forces said they killed all members of the 4-member terrorist group that entrenched inside the Karak Crusader castle. The Public Security Department and the Gendarmerie said 7 of their men were killed in the attack, in addition to 2 civilians and a Canadian citizen. 34 people were injured, including 11 public security officers, 4 gendarmerie members, 17 citizens and 2 foreigners. Investigations were underway to unveil all the details of the incident and determine the identity of the gunmen and their motives and affiliations. A security force had raided a house in Al-Gutranin near Karak, where the terrorists hide, and found large amounts of explosives as well as weapons and explosive belts. Interior Minister Salami Hamad told the press conference he thought the weapons and explosives found indicated that the terrorists had planned to carry out other attacks beyond Karak.
I think, judging by the quantity of explosives and weapons that were found, the target was not only Karak. This is a personal judgment, and until now all the information is not known. But when there are about 6 and 7 explosive builds and there are weapons, warehouses and bombs and explosions, I do not think the target is only Karak Castle. It could be more. But God enabled us to discover this cell before another incident.
Jordanians vowed they stand in one tranche against the evil forces and the vicious hands that targeted their country and took innocent lives. The martyrs were buried in their hometowns in funerals led by family members and security officers. His Royal Highness Prince Rashid bin Al Hassan led the funeral of the martyr Major Lieutenant Sa'id Ma'aita, who was laid to rest in his hometown of Karak. Lower House Speaker Atif Al-Tarawni, also in attendance, said the attack had brought Jordanians together in a show of national unity. He said the parliament would look into the details of what happened.
It is not the time for calling on the government. Today is about enforcing the inner front and standing together. Regarding demands and whether more work has to be done, the parliament will look into the events and the details of what happened. Later, Jordanians in general and Karak residents in particular will have information on all the events that happened.
Jordanians across the political and social spectrum were prompt in condemning the vicious attack by the outlaws and said they stand behind security forces in fighting terrorism. The Senate mourned the martyrs and said such cowardly acts of terrorism would strengthen the country's steadfastness in defeating terrorism. The lower house said the vicious hands had targeted the country in a desperate attempt to undermine its security. The Journalists Association and professional associations also staged rallies to condemn the attack and voice support to security agencies. They condoled the families of the martyrs and wished those injured a speedy recovery. Hala Debabne for the news at 10.
The terror attack on security forces brought condemnation and expressions of solidarity from Arab and world countries and organizations. The Palestinian National Reconciliation Government said it stood by Jordan in countering terrorism. The Awqaf Religious Endowment in Jerusalem said the perpetrators of the attack had no religion or ethics as they sought to undermine the kingdom's security. The Arab League expressed solidarity with Jordan and condolences to the victims' families. Expressions of solidarity also came from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Lebanon and Turkey. The United States and Canada and other world nations had also condemned the attacks and voiced support to Jordan. Also today, His Majesty met Iraqi political leaders for talks on political and security developments in Iraq. King Abdullah told Iraqi Vice President Usama al-Nujayfi, Deputy Prime Minister Saleh al-Mutlaq and Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament Salim al-Jbouri that Jordan would work with the Iraqis to support the country's stability and unity. He also stressed Arab support for Iraq's reconstruction and the fight against terrorism. The king said all Iraqis should agree on a roadmap leading to a better future, pledging Jordan's full support to Iraq through its presidency of the upcoming Arab Summit. He stressed Arab support for Iraqis in the next stage and to work with the international community to bolster the country's stability. The talks at Al Husseiniya Palace dealt with the challenges facing Iraq and how to help improve the situation in disaster-striking areas and the refugees. The Iraqi leaders voiced their condemnation of the terrorist attack that took the lives of Jordanian security men in Karak. They offered their condolences to Jordan and the families of the martyrs and wished the injured speedy recovery. His Majesty also welcomed Iraqi Vice President Ayad Allawi and discussed political and security developments in Iraq. His Majesty stressed Iraq's reconstruction, unity, a political system inclusive of all Iraqis, and a halt to foreign interference in the country's affairs. The meeting stressed the need to intensify Arab, regional and international efforts to combat terrorist organizations and also called for a common position on cooperation with the new US administration. Alawi thanked Jordan for its support to achieve Iraq's unity and stability and fight terrorist gangs. He condemned the terrorist attack in Karak. The Russian ambassador to Turkey was shot in the back and killed while giving a speech at an art gallery. Turkish security sources said the gunman who shouted, "Don't forget Aleppo," was an off-duty police officer who worked in the Turkish capital. The Russian Foreign Ministry confirmed the death of the envoy, Andrei Karlov, which marked one of the most serious spillovers of the Syria conflict. It called it a terrorist act. It was not immediately clear who was behind the attack. Thousands were evacuated from the last rebel-held enclave of Aleppo after a deal was reached to allow people to leave to besieged pro-government villages in nearby Idlib province. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said convoys of buses from eastern Aleppo reached rebel-held areas to the west of the city, and more buses left to the villages of Al-Fu'a and Kafriya for government lines. The United Nations Security Council agreed a resolution calling for UN officials and others to be allowed to monitor evacuations from East Aleppo and the safety of civilians still there. The Syrian ambassador to the United Nations, Bashar Jafari, denounced the resolution as propaganda. He said the last of the rebels were leaving and Aleppo would be clean by evening. Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu said 20,000 civilians had been evacuated from Aleppo so far. The United Nations World Food Programme provided aid for thousands of civilians fleeing eastern Aleppo.
Over the last few days, the World Food Programme has provided people fleeing East Aleppo with hot meals, fresh bread, and ready-to-eat food parcels. Now that we are able to access eastern Aleppo, we are rushing in to support thousands of Syrians inside eastern Aleppo who are in need of immediate assistance.
Over to Iraq. The harsh winter brings misery to Iraqi families fleeing Mosul. Families living in the Khaza refugee camp on the outskirts of Erbil, east of Mosul, said they were suffering from shortages of blankets, heating fuel and drinking water. According to the United Nations, nearly 91,000 people have been registered as displaced. The refugees have fled from the Daesh-held city of Mosul and nearby towns and villages since the beginning of the campaign against the terrorist group. The figure excludes thousands more forced back into Mosul by retreating militants. The United Nations said the number of people fleeing is expected to rise and increased their efforts to distribute winter supplies before temperatures drop further. And finally, snow began falling in the highlands of Ajloun and Jarash. The weatherman said temperatures will further drop tonight with an overnight low of 2 degrees in Amman. Thundery rain and hail showers are also forecast across the hilly areas and in the country's east after midnight. Tomorrow, the unstable weather conditions will continue. Therefore, it will be cold and partly cloudy with northwesterly moderate to brisk winds. The weatherman also warns against flash floods in low-lying areas and fog in the highlands. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect partly cloudy to cloudy skies with a high of 18 degrees, northerly winds and somewhat choppy seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. All ministers and public departments and institutions will observe a holiday on Sunday, December 25th and January 1st on the occasions of Christmas and the New Year. Prime Minister Hani Molqi's office released a statement announcing the holidays and congratulated the Christian community in the kingdom. And to close, here are our top stories once again. His Majesty is reassured on the condition of members of security forces and civilians who were injured in yesterday's terror attack. The King chairs a meeting of the National Policy Council and says Jordan can defeat terrorism and is resilient with its national unity. And the UN Security Council agrees a resolution calling for UN officials to be allowed to monitor evacuations from the east of the Syrian city of Aleppo. And with that, we come to the end of tonight's news. I'm Leo Balkar. Stay warm and thank you for joining us.